This is Professor Russell James coming to you from Texas Tech University. Welcome to today's lecture from Visual Plan Giving, an introduction to the law and taxation of charitable gift planning. Welcome to Private Foundations Part 2, Private Foundations versus Public Charities. This is Professor Russell James. There are three large classes of charitable organizations that can generate charitable tax deductions for donors: public charities, supporting organizations, and private foundations. Due to the relatively rare creation of supporting organizations, that is, wealth-holding entities designed to support a single or single set of public charities, this lecture will focus on public charities and private, non-operating foundations. Public charities are typically the organizations that actually do charitable work. Private foundations simply hold wealth and distribute grants to these public charities. In tax law, a charitable organization is, by default, treated as a private foundation. All 501c3 charitable organizations not meeting the guidelines for public charities or supporting organizations are automatically private foundations. Only if the charitable entity can prove it is a public charity or supporting organization will it be classified as such. The two ways in which an organization can prove it is a public charity are by showing that it actually engages in charitable operations, for example, running a church, hospital, school, or homeless shelter, or by showing that it receives widespread financial support from the public. Although most public charities actually engage in charitable activity, it is possible for grant-making bodies to be public charities if they receive widespread financial support. For example, community foundations and United Appeals, such as the United Way, can be public charities even if they do not engage in charitable operations, but instead only make grants to other public charities. Most private foundations have similar characteristics. They are usually funded by a single person, family, or corporation. They don't do charitable work, but instead make grants to charities. Usually, financial returns on their invested assets serve as the source of their charitable grants rather than ongoing gifts from fundraising. This idea of a pool of assets set aside by one person with charitable activity limited to issuing grants funded predominantly from investment income is the classic concept of the private foundation. The ways in which a charitable organization can avoid the default classification as a private foundation largely center on demonstrating a divergence from these classic elements of a private foundation. There are four approved pathways through which a charitable organization can qualify as a public charity. Traditional charities qualify as public charities because they are primarily engaged in the day-to-day operation of delivering charitable services. In sharp contrast to a typical private foundation, these organizations do not simply make grants to others engaged in charitable operations. Churches, hospitals, schools, and other traditional operating charities qualify as public charities rather than private foundations due to the nature of their operations. Another way that a charitable entity can be classified as a public charity is by having widespread financial support. Even if the charity is simply making grants and is not directly engaging in charitable operations, widespread financial support will cause it to be a public charity rather than a private foundation. In this first methodology, the concept of widespread financial support is a purely mathematical issue. The test is met if the support from those who individually give 2% or less of the total support, otherwise known as small donors, sums to at least 1/3 of all support given to the charity. In other words, if there are a lot of small donors who, when combined, are financially important to the organization, then the organization isn't a private foundation. Instead, it is a public charity. Suppose a grant-making charity receives total support of $100,000. If 35 donors gave $1,000 apiece and the charity's founder gave $65,000, this charity would still pass the test for being a public charity, because more than 1/3 of all support came from small donors. That is, those giving 2% or less of the total support. There are two additions to this rule that prevent the charity from being disqualified due to financial support from government or an unusual large gift from an outside donor. Government support is treated as small donor support, in other words, less than 2% of total support, regardless of how large a share the government support actually constitutes. For example, if a non-operating grant-making charity had $100,000 of total support, consisting of a $65,000 gift from the charity founder and a $35,000 grant from the government, the charity would qualify as a public charity. Additionally, unusual large gifts from an outside donor, in other words, not from the organization's founding donor, trustees, managers, or their families, can be ignored. Suppose a non-operating grant-making organization that otherwise would have had total support of $1,000 apiece from 35 donors and $65,000 from the founding donor received an additional one-time $100,000 gift from a wealthy donor, unrelated to any of the organization's insiders. If this unusual gift were included in the calculation, it would disqualify the organization from being a public charity, because the small donor support of $35,000 would then constitute only 17.5% of total support. For this reason, such an unusual gift from an outsider can be excluded from the calculation. A more subjective rule allows for small donor support, including government support, to constitute as little as 10% of the organization's total support. However, in order to take advantage of this lower limit, the charity must also fulfill two subjective requirements. First, the charity must be operated in such a way as to be intentionally attempting to attract new public or government support. In other words, the charity is not yet at the 1/3 level, but it is at 10% and appears to be working to grow that 10%. Finally, the, quote, facts and circumstances must suggest that it is appropriate to treat the organization as a public charity. In a sense, a charity, other than a traditional operating charity, with small donor and government support between 1/10 and 1/3 of total support, is in a maybe zone for qualification as a public charity. This subjectivity allows for open consideration of any circumstances that might make the charity appear more like a classic private foundation or more like a public charity. Because of the subjectivity, it may be useful to think of this as a, quote, smell test, asking, does this smell more like a private foundation or a public charity? Finally, a charity can qualify as a public charity based upon not only its small donor support, but also its income from memberships and any charitable operations. If these sum to at least 1/3 of total support, and the charity receives no more than 1/3 of total support from investment income, then the charity will qualify as a public charity. For example, if a local parent-teacher association received $10,000 in total income from $4,000 in memberships, $4,000 in bake sale profits, and $2,000 in investment returns, with no donations and no income from charitable operations, the organization would qualify as a public charity. This is because at least 1/3 of total support came from memberships. $4,000, which is 40% of total support. Small donations, in this case $0, and income from charitable operations, also $0. Additionally, no more than 1/3 of total support came from investment income, in this case $2,000, which is 20% of total support. If instead the organization received its $10,000 of total support from $4,000 in memberships and $6,000 in investment returns, then it would not qualify under this rule. This large investment income, more than 1/3 of all support, shades the organization more into the appearance of a private foundation. A charitable organization can qualify as a public charity through any of these 4 rules. However, if the charitable organization does not qualify under these rules, nor under rules for supporting organizations, then the default classification of a private foundation remains. This has been Private Foundations Part 2, Private Foundations versus Public Charities. Join us next time for Private Foundations Part 3, Tax Rules.